Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 12th chapter. The inspector put his hands in his pockets and, quickening his pace, decided that the dinner was ruined, not so much because of the fettuccine, it was more of a reason to leave the Orsinus Orca Osteria, how much from the staff, who behaved very inappropriately, and also because of these beggars. Galbraith wanted to get rid of the disgusting feeling, so he decided to go to a liquor store, which, fortunately for him, turned out to be almost next to this catering establishment, just on the other side of the road. In this very cramped room, where it was impossible to really walk past the shelves with alcohol, it was not particularly comfortable for him to move around in search of the right bottle. By this time, there was a large line of people at the cash register, and during the entire time that Galbraith was looking for some cheaper drink, not one of these people left the store, which also did not bring any good. When the inspector finally took the bottle of pink sparkling wine he liked and stood in line, he realized what was going on. The cash register froze after absolutely every item was sold and the cashier had to constantly restart it. Galbraith got tired of waiting, and he, putting the bottle in its original place, left this tiny alcohol market in completely upset feelings. He returned to the State of Snow Lake Hotel tight and dry. Having climbed the stairs to the 4th floor and entered his room, Galbraith was relieved to take off his jacket, slightly wet from the rain, and went to the bath. Having finished washing, he then went to the bed and, without knowing why, turned the mattress over. This innocent action made him shudder with disgust. Underneath him, on the surface of the bed, whole flocks of tiny red bugs swarmed. Without wasting a minute, Galbraith immediately went downstairs and called the concierge. Quite soon a gloomy old man in an old-fashioned blue tailcoat, without a single hair on his head, came out to see him. He looked the inspector up and down. "The only thing I can suggest to you is to change the room," the concierge said gloomily, as if thinking about the end of the world. "Is it really that hard for you to ask me to change my mattress?" As Galbraith, tired after the osteria, was not ready for this. "I'm sorry, but I'm not much help," the old man said firmly. "What about bed linen?" "My sheet is burned by a cigarette," said the inspector. "As compensation, I can ask that fresh fruit slices be delivered to your room," the concierge answered, continuing to stand like a stick of rhubarb. "All right, I accept that," Galbraith answered with a hint of despair. "At the expense of the establishment, of course," the old man added. The rules here are strange, Galbraith thought, climbing the stairs to his room, because the bed and some fruit are disproportionate to each other. The inspector couldn't help but think that whoever he met in London during this time, everyone who came across his path seemed to be crazy. Or it's just me too respectable for this city, he asked himself as he entered the room. Approaching the bed, he became convinced that it was impossible to sleep on it. The bedbugs he had disturbed were already crawling all over the bed linen. He began to prepare for the fact that he would apparently have to sleep on a shoe bench, which was just long enough for him to lie down on with his legs crossed. Then the concierge entered the room. He glanced at the tousled bed, did not say a word and, putting a small plate on the table, left. Galbraith came closer. Yes, there really were fruits there, but in what quantity? One slice each of apple, pear and orange, and, contrary to the words of the old man in the blue tailcoat, they were far from fresh. The apple and pear darkened, and the orange became weathered in the air. Well, of course, Galbraith thought, taking the plate in his hands, no one was going to feed him. The fruit is just a symbol of the fact that the staff of this hotel is supposedly sensitive to the guests. The inspector went to the trash bin and sent these fruits there, and, putting the plate on the desk, shuddered. Someone had again disturbed him with their visit. Galbraith turned around. It was the scrubwoman, a stout person in a greasy apron, who, having placed a bucket of water on the floor, started wiping the floor with a wet mop. The inspector went to the window so as not to interfere with her cleaning the room. Having nothing else to do, he looked down at the road where the cars were driving. The only sign that an accident occurred in the morning under his window was only a dark spot on the asphalt. Galbraith thought that if so much blood had flowed out, then that poor guy in the convertible had definitely went to the forefathers. Continuing to look at the road, he heard the creaking of the bathroom door. Well, finally, he thought, they would deign to clean the plaque in the toilet. But that was not the case. The scrub woman left there without spending even a minute there. Galbraith hoped that she at least put new toilet paper there. With these thoughts, he took his eyes off the road and looked at the scrub woman, who, gloomily looking ahead, was diligently spreading liquid dirt on the floor. Feeling the guest's stern gaze on her, she straightened her back and, squeezing out the mop, swept away the trash in the corners. What a service! Galbraith involuntarily burst out when the woman, having taken the bucket, was already leaving him. The scrub woman, hearing his voice, jerked her whole body so hard that a couple of drops of dirty water from her bucket splashed onto the door. She threw a frightened look at him and immediately disappeared into the corridor, forgetting about closing the door. "Oh yes, parsimony doesn't serve," the inspector said out loud. Galbraith closed the door behind the scrubwoman and, sighing, looked at the floor. It did not become cleaner. On the contrary, ugly black wet stains appeared on the linoleum. He approached the bed, where small red insects were swarming with might and main on the blanket, pillow, and sheet, because of which this piece of furniture looked as if it had been eaten away by rust, and this rust was alive and was constantly changing its pattern. Standing by the bed and contemplating this mess in a kind of trance, Galbraith breathed slowly and deeply, and the tips of his fingers twitched slightly from the indignation reigning inside. At another time, the inspector would have happily left not only this room, but the hotel in general, but now he was in a state where he had no choice. Tired after an unpleasant incident in the Ursinus Orca Osteria, both mentally and physically, he dreamed of only one thing: to give his body a horizontal position. Therefore, Galbraith, taking a stack of papers with material on the Farkraut's case from the desk, kicked off his shoes and collapsed on the bed infested with bugs. The next moment he felt how these parasites clung to his legs and arms, but he no longer cared. Magistratus opertet servire populo, he said quietly out loud with detachment. He remembered this Latin proverb, because it was precisely what was written on the very agitational banner under which the messenger sat, brought him the news about death of the last scion of the Yonce family. The meaning of this expression seemed appropriate to the inspector in the situation in which he found himself, if only because, having drawn himself into this mysterious matter, he, willy-nilly, was obliged to serve this very people, if only out of a sense of elementary conscience. Galbraith involuntarily remembered the kind-hearted Matt McLaren, whose exciting story set this whirlpool of events in motion. How he is doing there now. How were things going with his friends in Portland now, while Galbraith was hanging around here, unsuccessfully trying to find traces of Dr. Baselard, who, as he knew, had left for England after that fateful surgery. To England, on affairs, these words were forever etched in the inspector's memory when he came to the apartment of this child murderer. He remembered that he went to bed precisely in order to continue reading the file of his now deceased friend. Galbraith involuntarily felt pity. No, not Galbraith, although that would be logical. The inspector regretted that there was not a single chair in this room. He brought the stack of sheets to his eyes and, trying to understand where he stopped last time, got ready to read this magnum opus. As a result, he began from the moment when the author of this investigation went to the scene of the death of janitor Theodore Beckel. Trying to keep the entire document in an official tone, Farkraut, sparing with expressions, dryly wrote that at the pedestrian crossing where the body was found, he was unable to find anything that could arouse suspicion. The only thing is that the paint that was used for the marked crosswalk has worn off over time. For a moment Galbraith resurrected in his head the appearance of urban roads in Portland. Yes, this is not London, he thought. He went back to reading. The document stated that when Farkraut, not finding anything on the road, went into a public toilet located opposite the shopping center, out of necessity, of course, then there he noticed that in the booth he entered, the Arabic numeral 4 was written on the wall. As the author of the investigation wrote, he would not have mentioned this moment if not for several curious details. Firstly, Farkraut began to list, an unknown vandal was wielding a black alkyd car enamel, although inscriptions of this kind are usually drawn with ordinary markers. Secondly, Galbraith's friend noticed that the numeral was written not once, but 4 times, and a glance at the inscription was enough to understand that the vandal was applying paint with sweeping movements, as if trying to bring it to the entire wall, but in the end the paint apparently ran out, so he repeated only 4 times and not 5 or more. In addition, Farkraut, out of the blue, felt obliged to write in an official document his thought that it was somehow strange to him that the owner of the toilet did not get rid of the inscription. He could understand if the toilet was somewhere in the wilderness, but no, this place is used by people leaving the shopping center. Having read this ode to a public toilet, Galbraith involuntarily thought that his friend did the right thing in not becoming a writer. With this style, his books could of course be bought by inertia, simply because a new author has appeared on the market. But then his works would be avoided, because readers would already know that the language of this writer is boring and difficult to understand. Galbraith took the next sheet of paper, which described the inspection of the place where the janitor's body lay, how the police took measurements with tape measures and Farkraut gave them instructions. Galbraith thought, it seems to me, or did the author of the document mix up the moments? After all, when the inspector reported about the toilet, he wrote that he entered it after he examined the dead Theodore Beckel. Yawning, the inspector simply decided to skip this rather boring passage and changed the page again. Now Farkraut wrote about the investigation into the death of Penelope Conway, the saleswoman in certain duty-free shop. Unlike Theodore Beckel, where apart from the inscription in the toilet there was nothing interesting to read, the description of Conway's apartment involuntarily attracted Galbraith, if only because Farkraut wrote this excerpt in a slightly more lively language. His friend noted that as soon as he entered the saleswoman's apartment, he immediately drew attention to the mirror hanging in the hallway. The fact was that the glass was covered with a white chintz covering. Farkraut wrote that he asked the deceased's aunt if it was her doing, to which the woman replied that she did not touch anything in the apartment and the mirror was covered even when she herself had just arrived at her niece's apartment. Galbraith's friend, who apparently thought that the readers would not understand his bewilderment, began to justify his suspicions by saying that a mirror is usually curtained when a person has already died, because there is a belief according to which the spirit of the owner, who has already departed to another world, wanders around the apartment. Witless mystical nonsense, muttered Galbraith, scratching his incredibly itchy leg from bedbugs. Still, the medic Maurice was right that day when he said you're talking about your supernatural rubbish again, meaning the circumstance that Farkraut found meaning in things that in the world of materialism have absolutely no meaning. A law enforcement officer shouldn't believe in miracles, Galbraith said involuntarily, taking his eyes off the letters and staring at the ceiling. He always said this to himself when he encountered something that he could not explain in simple words. It just seemed to him that the world obeys physical laws, and any, even the strangest phenomenon, must be approached from the position of a physicist, not a poet. Another thing is that the inspector himself did not have extensive knowledge of either one or the other, being essentially a simple man in the street who, by the will of fate, became a policeman. Galbraith understood that he should not even delve into these things, but his profession, which is conducive to the construction of hypotheses, forced his brain to work in a direction in which he would never have gone in everyday life. Oh, he thought to himself, why was I so driven to become a police inspector at one time? After all, he could sit in the studio and paint paintings to order, but no, he has to get his hands dirty in the blood of criminal cases. Having pushed away these rhetorical thoughts, he returned to the document. His friend wrote that if we take words of Penelope Conway's aunt at face value, it turns out that the mirror was actually curtained before the relative entered the apartment. The author of these lines wondered, it turns out that the unknown killer did this on purpose? Farkraut further hypothesized that perhaps it could have been a strange gesture of respect for the deceased and thought, not without reason, that the killer could have been a person who was not indifferent to the deceased saleswoman. Murder out of jealousy, Galbraith said thoughtfully after reading this. He involuntarily thought that he himself was driven by this feeling. Only the inspector could not fully understand who he was jealous of and, most importantly, to whom. He continued reading. While inspecting Conway's apartment, Inspector Farkraut noted the fact that only one shelf was occupied in her bookcase, and there was essentially only one book: mythology, timeless tales of gods and heroes, the author of which was a certain Edith Hamilton. Friend of Galbraith was quite surprised by the fact that an entire shelf was occupied by 20 copies of this very book alone, and even the edition was the same. The inspector again wondered on the pages of his material, maybe the saleswoman bought the books to give them to friends? But why then was there no other book in her apartment, not even a cookbook? The late Penelope Conway didn't like to read, or she collected all the books that were in the closet before, to sell them and use the proceeds to buy 20 copies of just one book about Greek myths? Having asked these questions to the readers, the author then noted that in the remaining empty space on the bottom shelf, 5 more books with the same number of pages could fit. I wonder how he checked it, thought Galbraith. He understood that the profession of a police inspector requires a certain way of thinking from a person, but it was difficult for him to imagine his friend wasting his time on such a stupid task as moving books from one place to another. Galbraith involuntarily remembered how, even before the death of the pharmaceutist's young daughter, he was visiting Mr. Chief Inspector, drinking Pimm's with him. In the tone of a professor speaking about a favorite student, Skidmore praised Farkraut's ability to pay attention to things that would seem completely meaningless to another person. Then, pouring myself a glass of English fruit liqueur, Galbraith thought that Mr. Chief Inspector had always dreamed of sitting down at the same table with Farkraut and writing a joint material on a topic that interested both of them. It's just that something didn't allow him to do it. Galbraith suggested that the problem was, firstly, that Skidmore was busy, and secondly, that such behavior simply somehow did not fit into the relationship between master and servant. He suddenly woke up and remembered that it was time to finish reading, if only because angry bugs were already crawling on his skin with might and main. Therefore, then Galbraith simply skimmed the text with his eyes, without really trying to delve into the essence. Now the document contained a description that in addition to identical sets of white dresses, in the deceased's wardrobe at the very bottom there was a box in which lay, the inspector's friend then listed the items, a leather collar with spikes, a tape for tying hands, a tickler and gag. Further, Farkraut wondered whether the deceased had a boyfriend, because, as he wrote, he was confused by the fact that Miss Fay had always had a reserved character and, as far as the inspector himself could judge, she had never really fallen in love. Wait, who is Miss Fay? Galbraith exclaimed in bewilderment. A second later it dawned on him that this piece of text did not agree with what had been written earlier. He ran his eyes over the paper. The names of the pimp Alexander Obrant and Eugene Woods, his killer, were already there. It turns out that when Galbraith dropped this stack of sheets, he collected them without any system, which is why it was now almost impossible to read the case of his late friend, because without observing chronology, the connection between hypotheses and facts was lost. What could it be? Great reading, Galbraith sighed and threw the stack of papers up in grief. Materials of Farkraut's case fell to the floor again, like leaves in autumn, only these were strange leaves, not yellow and red, but white and with black lines of letters. The inspector felt as if he had been deceived. Well, of course, he thought, I'm himself made a mistake, and himself is reaping its fruits. Here he completely out of place remembered that in Farkraut he was always surprised by the fact that when asked if he had a girlfriend, his friend answered that this did not apply to his person, because he adheres to the idea that fate itself measures who will continue their family line, and who will die without offspring. Very strong word, Galbraith said loudly and clearly, feeling his skin burning because of the insects. After Galbraith commented out loud on the expression of his late friend that randomly came to mind, he, trying not to go crazy from the bites of annoying bedbugs, took off his outer clothing and crawled under the blanket. Red insects began to creep even more viciously over his body. They crawled under his armpits, clung to his chest and legs, and the most arrogant parasites tried to get into the inside of his ears and nostrils. Perhaps there was an additional effect of the fact that in the darkness he could not see their exact number, but, one way or another, the discomfort gradually increased, and soon the inspector woke up in the middle of the night. "I have had enough," he shouted into the void. As he was barefoot, Galbraith walked to the wall switch and extended his hand forward. His index finger touched the white plastic snap. There was a barely audible click, and the room immediately became bright. He looked down and looked at his legs. The bedbugs hung on his skin like ants clinging to a twig. Oh, he thought, if he had not accidentally turned over the mattress, then probably the insects would not have come out. Walking into the bathroom, he turned on the shower and stood under its cold streams. Trying to wash away the vile insects, Galbraith in his thoughts returned to Portland. At first I just remembered how good it was for him there, how he could sleep peacefully in his small apartment without fighting bedbugs. Then, when he was able to get rid of most of the parasites, he sat down on the edge of the bath, focusing on the moment when he finally decided that he needed to leave for this very London. Nothing particularly unusual happened at that time. Galbraith was just walking to his home after a tiring day at work. That evening there was a chilly wind blowing, so he didn't want to linger outside too long and walked at an accelerated pace. By the time he reached About Street, dusk had already fallen on the street. Approaching house E14, the inspector put his hand into his jacket pocket. He always pulled out his keys in advance, and raised his head up. What he saw made him shake off a touch of melancholy. The window of his apartment was brightly lit. Galbraith remembered very well that he had not turned on the light in the room since the previous evening, so there could be no doubt that someone else had gotten into his apartment. The inspector's heart began to beat wildly, and he, groping for his small but trusty service pistol in his inner pocket, feverishly ran into the entrance of the house. Luckily for him, he didn't run into any neighbors inside, so he could safely take out his weapon without fear that anyone would notice. Galbraith ran up the steps to the second floor with a loud stomp, and, holding the weapon with his left hand, inserted the key into the keyhole. His hands were wet with sweat, his fingers were shaking as if in a fever, such was the power of fear that gripped the police inspector at that second. Finally, he was able to get the key into the well. Leaning with his whole body, Galbraith turned it. In the process, the metal of the key almost bent. The door creaked quietly, and Galbraith, with his pistol at the ready, crossed the threshold with the agility of a wild animal in one fell swoop. "Good evening, Mr. Inspector. I'm glad you finally came." Suddenly a completely calm senile voice was heard. He expected to see anyone in his apartment, bandits, gangsters, crazy clowns in the end. But what was his surprise when it turned out that sitting on the chair standing by the window was none other than Mr. Chief Inspector himself. "You are not in movie, Galbraith," Skidmore said tranquilly, albeit with some reproach. Indeed, the scene looked incredibly stupid. Apartment owner stood opposite his guest, pointing the barrel of a gun at him. Galbraith immediately felt uneasy. "I find myself begging your pardon," he said embarrassedly, slowly lowering his service pistol. "Please, be seated." "I needed to speak with you," imperturbably Skidmore said. Apparently, Galbraith thought, Mr. Chief Inspector has no fear of death at all, if he didn't even raise an eyebrow at this prank with the pistol. Putting the weapon in the inside pocket of his jacket, he looked up at guest. "Well, you know, I'm not going to sit," he said quietly. "You are nervous and that's your business," Skidmore said. "But keep in mind that in this case you will have to stand for a long time. I'm not some soft-handed for whom standing for a couple of hours is already a burden," Galbraith answered with a hint of resentment. These words brought a hint of a smile to the face of Mr. Chief Inspector Skidmore. The old man seemed to enjoy watching the excited man who was 20 years his junior. "I have to say, I like your way of expressing your opinion." The smile was replaced by calm again. "But I didn't come to you to admire your confusion." Well, of course, Galbraith thought sarcastically to himself, Mr. Chief Inspector quietly snuck in his subordinate's apartment, and he thinks that the owner of the apartment will find this as ordinary as a morning meal. "The essential point is, I want to give you a message," began his guest. With these words, Skidmore reached out and took a white pack of cigarettes from the table. The apartment owner hurried to approach Mr. Chief Inspector in order to obligingly light his cigarette, but he silently dismissed him with a gesture and lit it himself with his lighter. "So, Galbraith, taking a drag," he said. "I understand your attitude towards her, so I will not ask you why you decided not to tell me about your schedules." "What does he mean?" Galbraith thought. Who is this she with whom, according to the old man, he himself feels some kind of special relationship? That is why, Skymore continued. I didn't ask you to share your suspicions with me. In relation to whom? Galbraith involuntarily burst out. Dr. Baselard, who else would it be? Answered Mr. Chief Inspector and blew out a cloud of smoke. Galbraith involuntarily admired what a neat ring his honorable guest had made. Yes, he thought, the skill to smoke is also an art. Why did you decide that I suspect him? He asked Skymore with irony in his voice. Because I, as a man who was closely acquainted with him, was well aware of the fact that his person could not but arouse suspicion, especially in a subject with such a turn of mind as yours. The owner of the apartment involuntarily widened his eyes when his guest unloaded this expatiation on him. How, he thought, could Mr. Chief Inspector really have a connection with that doctor? It didn't fit in his head. Are you all right? Skymore asked, looking at his interlocutor's embarrassment. Forgive me, Galbraith woke up from shock and lowered his eyes. I understand that this surprises you, the guest answered calmly. It's okay, Avita, he said suddenly. Galbraith could not understand the meaning of the last three words of his interlocutor, but could not help but restrain himself from losing his temper and unleashing a stream of words on Mr. Chief Inspector. Surprises? Is that what you call it? Trying not to raise his voice, he slightly clenched his fists. Do you really think that I can put up with the fact that this damnable doctor, Galbraith did not try to choose expressions, not only does he not displease you, but it turns out that he is also your friend? Having blurted this out, the inspector felt his temperature rise. He raised his right hand to his hair to wipe away the sweat that had formed on his forehead, but the next second something fell to the floor. He bent down. It turned out that he had forgotten that he had been holding a lighter in it all this time, wanting to light the cigarette of his uninvited guest. You look amazing in anger, Skymore said unexpectedly. Galbraith, who had already picked up the lighter, froze in one position again. He did not expect that his interlocutor would not only not be offended by his behavior, but, on the contrary, would praise this fleeting, uncontrollable outburst of wrath. You are motivated by fury, his interlocutor continued. And I understand this. The person of that subject can evoke only two reactions, either admiration for his intellect, or sharp hatred of his nature. I don't understand you, Galbraith admitted honestly. Dr. Baselard is a very complicated man, Skymore said briefly. It's understatement, thought the owner of the apartment. He got the feeling that Skymore was trying to show the good side of this man. I understand that you now think that I am whitewashing him, as if reading the thoughts of the interlocutor, Skymore said. But I really didn't mean it that way. Maybe you think that I suspect you yourself, Galbraith could not resist. Poor Neo, the guest answered in an incomprehensible language. In the situation in which you find yourself, there is nothing left to do but suspect each and every one. Having said this, Mr. Chief Inspector rose from his chair. The owner of the apartment simply stood still and watched, almost in divine awe, as Skymore put a cigarette in the ashtray and, straightening his tie, looked out the window. Galbraith followed his gaze. Night had already fallen. I will allow myself express aloud what I think might have occurred to you. His guest turned away from the window and crossed his arms over his chest. So what will you say? For some reason this gesture of his interlocutor amused Galbraith. The fact that in your head no, but thoughts flashed about the fact that wrongdoer Jordan Thurlow and his victim Delia Yonce are of the same blood. How, at these words, Galbraith's jaw began to drop. How should I know? Skymore guessed what he wanted to say. The fact of the matter, out of nowhere. I said it at random, he answered calmly. Now others will begin to mistrust me too, thought Galbraith. He sighed and, raising his eyes to the ceiling, began to stretch his cervical vertebrae. Not to mention, Mr. Chief Inspector suddenly said. I don't think you'll be interested in knowing this. Hearing this, apartment owner immediately perked up and looked at his guest. These are affairs of bygone days, but still I think that Baselard took Duncan's life out of mercy. Are you talking about brain surgery? Galbraith remembered perfectly well who his interlocutor was talking about now. Right. It just seems to me that Baselard decided to meet the poor guy halfway. The woodcutter's death was not an accident. The doctor knew from the very beginning that brain surgery would end in death, and realizing that Duncan still could no longer live normally in condition like that. Are you saying that Dr. Baselard killed Duncan with his tacit consent? A sudden insight dawned on the middle-aged inspector. You can interpret my words as you please, Skymore said instead of answering. Mr. Chief Inspector, taking his hat off the back of his chair, headed towards the exit from the apartment. Galbraith slowly, as if afraid to step on his feet, trotted after the departing guest. Skymore, already grabbing the handle of the front door, turned to the owner. I can tell you one thing for sure, Dr. Baselard is not the bloodthirsty killer you think he is, he said dryly. Hearing these words, Galbraith unexpectedly lowered his gaze. Have a good night. Already from the entryway the voice of Mr. Chief Inspector was heard. At this moment, Galbraith suddenly woke up from his memories. He looked around, as if not understanding where he was. Whatever it was, he told himself, Portland was a thing of the past, and now he was sitting in the bathroom of a shabby London hotel room. He looked at his feet, so far there was not a single bug on his skin. Well, soon they will surround me again, said the inspector with a sigh. Coming out of the bathroom, he, shaking from the cold, dived under the blanket, completely forgetting that he needed to turn off the light in the room. Galbraith was so tired after the cold bath that as soon as he closed his eyes, he immediately fell asleep. The inspector slept peacefully, without dreams. Waking up the next day, Galbraith noted with great displeasure that while he was sleeping, bedbugs again covered him from head to toe. There is nothing to do, he thought, and ran to the bathroom. Not so much for the sake of washing, but for the sake of getting rid of parasites under running water. After rinsing off, the inspector did not brush his teeth, he even forgot to dry himself with a towel. Approaching the window, he looked at the road and froze, but this time not because he was fascinated by the sight of the cars. The fact was that right under his window sill on the sidewalk below stood a certain young guy in a red shirt. Galbraith immediately suspected something was wrong. It seemed to him that this person had been standing there for some time, and clearly in such a convenient place to monitor the room where the inspector himself was now staying. Standing by the window, Galbraith looked down at the young guy. He could not see his face, which was hidden behind the wide-open newspaper. Yeah, the inspector thought, the guy is pretending that he just stopped to read an interesting note, the most commonplace spy trick. Suddenly, as he was thinking about this, the mysterious stranger lowered the newspaper, and Galbraith was able to examine him a little more carefully. The scout Galbraith had no doubt that this was not a random passerby, had long black hair that curled slightly into curls at the ends. This guy's nose was slightly turned up, and his facial features gave him a vague resemblance to the pretty face of young Japanese pop stars. After analyzing all this, the inspector remembered that he had seen exactly the same face on the plane when he was flying to London. It seems that it was exactly the same frail guy with whom he was sitting then with the old man. Galbraith unfortunately forgot what that fellow traveler was wearing, but it didn't matter, after all, is not the clothes that makes the man, and the man's clothes, who, if not the policeman, should know this. Having made sure that this guy had not noticed him from the street, Galbraith walked away from the window and headed back to the bathroom. Now he washed himself properly, not forgetting to brush his teeth. Then he picked up a razor. He wanted to shave. Alas, the inspector abandoned this case for the umpteenth time because, without calculating the effort, he rubbed too hard on the cheek and ended up cutting the skin. The blood flowed in a thin and seemingly endless red stream. Yes, apparently it's not my destiny to shave, thought Galbraith. Leaving the bathroom, he needed to find cotton wool and alcohol to stop the bleeding. He found either one nor the other in the suitcase. And he even remembered why, when he was packing for the trip, he was told that he should never take alcohol with him, otherwise he might be stopped at customs. Galbraith called the concierge to the room and, while he was waiting for him to arrive, went to the bathroom again and put his cheek under the stream of water. He knew it wouldn't do much good, but at least the cold water dulled the pain somewhat. Soon there was a knock on the door, and the inspector went to open it. However, instead of the concierge, an old man in a blue tailcoat, a young parlourmaid, answered his call. "I'm sorry, Mr. Galbraith," she began hastily right from the doorway, "but Mr. Tibor won't be able to come today." Having quickly uttered these words, she immediately fell silent, and at the same time shuddered, as if someone had pulled her from behind. The inspector tried not to pay too much attention to it. "Why'd he?" Galbraith asked out of politeness. "He was taken to the hospital last night," said the woman, and shuddered all over again. "You will continue to say with one word at a time," the inspector said, somewhat dissatisfied. This twitch of the interlocutress was already starting to get on Galbraith's nerves. What was the reason for the parlourmaid's state of mind was unclear to him, but the fact remained that she behaved somehow strangely, which is why he himself had a not very pleasant feeling at that moment. Mr. Tibor was diagnosed with cancer symptoms. "I do not want to elaborate on this," the parlourmaid said, this in a tone that looked like she was about to cry. "Okay, let's not talk about it," the inspector reassured her. The woman continued to stand on the threshold, and Galbraith noticed that at the moments when she spoke, her neck visibly inflated, like a bellows. There must be something wrong with her lungs, he thought to himself. "Could you bring some cotton wool to my room?" he turned to her after 5 seconds of silence. "Sorry, please speak clearly," the woman batted her eyelashes. "I called a man here to bring me cotton wool. I cut myself," Galbraith said it loud and clear. The parlourmaid listened to him, continuing to bat her eyelashes like a noctambulant. With every second her neck inflated more and more, as if it were a balloon that was about to burst. Galbraith wondered why she had such strange behavior. "Cut yourself further," the woman suddenly shouted rudely. "Excuse me, do you mind?" Galbraith, surprised by her sudden outburst of aggression, tried to control himself. "This is not a pharmacy to be dragged all sorts of medicinal muck for you," the parlourmaid shouted with hatred and left his room. "Wait, where are you going?" the inspector called after her. "Do not address me for such things," came her scream from the corridor. Closing the door behind her, Galbraith thought that apparently this parlourmaid was either a child or concubine of the concierge. The inspector couldn't find another reason for her aggression, and he didn't really want to. He had long ago realized that guests are not welcome in State of Snow Lake Hotel. He had to take a handkerchief from his suitcase instead of cotton wool, not the cleanest, but at least something, and with its help try to do something about the cut. Having stopped the bleeding in half with grief, Galbraith decided that he had enough of sitting in this room, in which the bed was a complete anthill, the staff was inadequate, and the interior is far from luxury class. The inspector began to pack his things, but when he began to look for where he had put his spare shirt, there was another knock on the door, and he again had to go open it. "Mr. Galbraith, you've got a visitor." It was still the same parlourmaid, only now she seemed to have calmed down. "Who, excuse me?" asked Galbraith. "Not a young man," as if doubting the accuracy of her words, the woman answered. "He can wait." The inspector was not in the mood to host any unknown men in his room. "He said he was on important business," the parlourmaid said firmly. "Well, let him come in." Galbraith waved his hand and walked away from the door. He walked to the window and looked down. The guy in the red shirt was no longer there. Maybe it really was a random passerby. "Good afternoon," someone's insinuating voice called out to him. Galbraith turned around. A middle-aged man entered the room, not as old as the parlourmaid presented the visitor, although with silver hair. Apparently, the suddenness with which the owner of the room turned around scared this man a little, because he backed away slightly when the inspector stared at him. He looks like a medic," Galbraith thought, looking at this uninvited visitor, dressed in a strict brown suit over which was thrown a white medical gown. "So I understand that you are a doctor," the inspector expressed his guess out loud. "No, you made a mistake," the man answered with some sly gleam in his eyes. "I work in the field which holds the key to the future." "And which one exactly?" Galbraith was intrigued by this definition. "Computer technologies," the interlocutor answered calmly. After these words, the silver-haired man modestly lowered his eyes, but it was clear that in fact he was almost bursting with importance. So that's the way it is, thought the inspector. Looking at this man, a memory involuntarily came to his mind of how back in 1981, when he first saw a used Tandy microcomputer at the police academy, he got into an argument with its operator. That cheerful guy, sitting at the keyboard, told Galbraith, who was standing next to him, that the computer is a product of evolution, comparable to the invention of the steam engine. Without skimping on expressions, the operator said that mass computerization is the future of humanity, which will lead it out of the swamp of ignorance. Galbraith himself responded to this expatiation by saying that he certainly understands that soon computers will be used in all areas of life, but computerization is inherently a bilge pump, after all. A simple strike of power plant workers all over the earth is enough for all electronics, including computers, to turn into a pile of useless scrap metal, and with this a terrible crisis will begin. And Galbraith did not fail to cite libraries as an example. In his opinion, if knowledge is only in electronic form, then with the loss of electricity, civilization will return to a state close to the Stone Age. When he said this, the computer operator yelled that he was a pessimist and also, apparently, a spy sent by the communists. Yes, Galbraith thought, something similar was said to Farkraut at the University of Portland, only unlike him, I was not kicked out because of this conversation. The inspector looked up from his memories and turned to his visitor. Well, if you work in the field of the future, then I'm certainly very happy, he started. Well, how could it be otherwise? The silver-haired man interrupted him. Wait, I didn't finish, Galbraith said. I wanted to ask how you found out about me. At these words his visitor pulled out a small white card from his pocket and, holding it in his left hand, said, I'm a specialist from the Makoto Computerization Institute and we are looking for volunteers. He began to speak. What other volunteers? Did I write somewhere that I want? The inspector interrupted him with growing dissatisfaction. Now it's your turn to listen to me. Raising his voice, the silver-haired man flashed his eyes. Okay, I get the message, Galbraith exhaled noisily. We need volunteers so that from the point of view of a common person we can evaluate the computer's dreams, the specialist said with some pathos. The computer's dreams, the inspector repeated the last words of his interlocutor in amazement. It's a long story, you better come to us right away, and we'll all, the silver-haired man didn't finish speaking. Interrupting the phrase mid-sentence, the specialist put the card he had been holding in his hands on the nightstand. See you, he said cheerfully, heading towards the exit of the room. After 2 seconds Galbraith went to the nightstand and picked up a piece of white glossy cardboard. This business card had only 2 lines, the name of the institution the visitor was talking about, as well as the address. Galbraith, peering at the small letters, suddenly heard the visitor slam the door, and almost uttered the exclamation, Hey wait, stop. Having put the card back, the inspector ran to the door and opened it, but there was no one in the corridor. Okay, Galbraith thought, what's the point of chasing after this stranger because that he forgot to ask him how he knew about his modest person. Closing the door, the inspector glanced at the nightstand and returned to the bed. Not wanting to be covered in bedbugs again, he simply sat down on the blanket and stared straight ahead. Galbraith's head was now in complete chaos. From the very beginning of this whole story with Dr. Baselard, the inspector's nerves were already beginning to fray, but now, being in a foreign country, in the room of this terrible hotel, Galbraith's paranoia began to progress. He immediately began to suspect that this visitor, who introduced himself as a computer specialist, was affiliated with that gynecological surgeon. Galbraith was well aware that his own visit to the doctor, which took place back in Portland, undoubtedly made Baselard confident that the police had already arranged surveillance on him and therefore would not miss the opportunity to send a policeman after him. Therefore, after leaving America, Dr. Baselard apparently warned his friends in London in advance so that they would monitor the people who would look for him. This hypothesis has the right to life, Galbraith thought. Thinking about America, the inspector could not help but remember that it was rather strange that none of the Portland Police Bureau people cared about the escaped doctor. All the police did was to arrest Baselard's assistants who were present during the hysterectomy operation. They were interrogated, and after recording their words, and no further action was taken. And only Galbraith insisted that one should not turn a blind eye to this. A couple of days after the case of Delia's death was closed, he volunteered to catch the instigator of this incident. The police looked at him as an idiot who decided to chase a ghost. Galbraith was told that his idea of catching Baselard did not make sense, because the death of daughter of certain pharmaceutist was not an event for which it was worth catching a person who had already moved to another country. The inspector was told by his superiors that the Portland police saw no point in asking the Metropolitan Police Service to hand over a some surgeon to them. It was incredibly lucky, Galbraith thought, that someone did apply, and soon he was issued a visa, bought a plane ticket and booked a room in the very hotel where he was now sitting. It is possible that this patron, who wished to remain anonymous, was Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore himself, but Galbraith did not have time to particularly understand who helped him and with what thoughts, because at that time he was already packing his things to fly to England. Due to the overwhelming emotions and impressions, it was difficult for the inspector to put his thoughts in order. Galbraith returned to today's guest. This silver-haired man clearly knew him by sight. This specialist was well aware that he would be staying in this room of State of Snow Lake Hotel. Who it might have been. Galbraith began to think that his today's visitor was probably Baselard's assistant, perhaps even his closest disciple. Apparently, he received Baselard when he arrived in London, and, having learned from the doctor the signs of Galbraith, in some incomprehensible way he tracked down the inspector and paid him a visit, just to make sure that his master was being hunted. "Don't be in such a hurry," Galbraith said quietly to himself. "Need to calm down." Sitting on the bed, he felt as if the world around him was spinning at a frantic pace cante flamenco. What made matters worse was the fact that even without going to bed, the bugs still took the opportunity to stick around a person. Feeling a disgusting itch all over his skin, Galbraith got up and went to the window, hoping that the parasites wouldn't get him here. Looking at the already tired landscape of the road, he began to remember what he knew about Baselard's assistants. As he remembered, there were only two of them, a man named Norman Van Riesen and a woman named Caitlin Armour. At first they interrogated the female. Because she easily made contact with the police, it seemed that she herself was going towards the investigation. In addition to facts of little interest to Galbraith about how she gave Baselard instruments and other medical supplies, she also told an interesting detail. It turns out that the doctor, before starting to operate on Delia Yonce, publicly stated that after the operation he would need to urgently fly to England, because he was not sure that the girl was unlikely to be able to recover after the removal of an important internal organ. When Caitlin Armour was asked if she remembered whether Dr. Baselard specified the city to which he was going, she said that he limited himself to only a general definition of the country. Then Galbraith recalled how the second assistant, a male, was interrogated. The police interrogating him found it difficult to extract words from this unusually sullen man. It seemed as if Dr. Baselard had deliberately hired a misanthrope as his assistant, as if he knew that if the police intervened, this man would not spill the beans. However, Norman Van Riesen did tell the police a couple of details, of which Galbraith especially remembers the second. Staring at the police with hateful eyes from under his thick eyebrows, this man said in a hoarse voice that after they removed uterus from the girl, Mr. Baselard, together with Miss Armour, began to remove some kind of thing from the organ. Mr. Van Riesen could not pronounce its Latin name. Norman himself received an order from the doctor, the essence of which was that he had to dial some telephone number on the phone and, after waiting for the subscriber to pick up, shout in the most hysterical voice possible any nonsense that came into his head. Alas, the police interrogating Norman Van Riesen were unable to get him to remember the words he shouted into the phone, because after telling them this story, he lost his temper and began screaming for them to let him go to his wife. In any case, these words about the phone call made Galbraith remember that very morning when, the day after the day of his vacation, he was woken up by a call and, picking up the phone, he heard a hysterical voice that shouted, "Maestro, say você." Você means you. Then Galbraith was out of sorts and immediately hung up, but now that he was aware of who the unknown caller was, it now dawned on him why he then had a feeling of some impending trouble. Poor Delia, the inspector thought to himself. Galbraith, who was already tired of looking at cars passing along the street, realized that he can't just stand there and indulge in memories in vain. He walked away from the window and began looking for clothes, wondering what to do. He threw out the idea of moving out of this state of Snow Lake Hotel. Firstly, a feeling of stinginess did not allow him to just give up a room for which he had paid almost $600 in American money. Secondly, it seemed to the inspector that if he now began to bother himself with moving, then, being busy with this matter, he would not be able to properly comprehend the visit of this strange specialist. After getting dressed, Galbraith went to the door and, after checking that he had not forgotten either his wallet or documents, went down the stairs and left the hotel building. He already knew what the weather was like outside, because he stood at the window for almost a quarter of an hour, but he did not expect that it would be so hot outside. Regretting that he forgot to wet his shirt before leaving, he hailed a taxi and, opening the door, addressed the driver. "Take me to a restaurant you would recommend," Galbraith said dryly. Having made himself comfortable and slammed the door, the inspector had to wait until the driver collected his thoughts. "I have Clarendon in mind," he said 15 seconds later. "What's that?" the passenger asked indifferently. "Venita's restaurant," answered the driver, pressing the pedal. The car started moving, and Galbraith, not trying to delve into the meaning of the driver's last words, stared out the window. He decided to trust someone who knew London because he didn't want to find a restaurant himself. His sad experience with the Ursinus Orca Osteria made him abandon any attempts to personally find places for the rest. Yes, he thought, it would certainly be much easier if I were an ordinary tourist, whom the guide almost leads by the hand, but alas, his incognito travel put an end to such conveniences. The inspector watched how, during the trip, the urban view outside the window was gradually replaced by rural landscapes. "Wow, how far away this Clarendon apparently is," thought Galbraith. Couldn't a native Londoner recommend a restaurant that was in the city center? Is it possible? Here the inspector involuntarily smiled. In the center of the capital of England there are such terrible restaurants that Londoners prefer to dine almost in the middle of nowhere? But he did not have time to think this thought through to the end. "Get out," the driver abruptly said rudely. "What, are we there yet?" Galbraith woke up, turning away from the window. "I reiterate, get out," the taxi driver repeated without malice, but firmly. "All right, as you please," the inspector opened the door and got out of the car. "I'll refuel and come back for you," the driver shouted after him and turned on the ignition. Galbraith watched his car. He thought, the taxi driver's behavior is strange. What's the difference whether he will refuel with or without a passenger? The inspector took his eyes off the yellow car that had already disappeared in the distance and looked around. He stood by a wooden fence, behind which he could see a one-story cottage of not particularly attractive appearance. What surprised Galbraith was that this was the only house in the area. The rest of the landscape was a steppe without a single tree, with grass scorched by the sun. "What kind of place is it?" the inspector asked himself. The next second, a bark reached his ears. The dog that made it, as Galbraith realized, was behind the fence outside of which he was now standing. He took a couple of steps from the fence, when suddenly he saw a man walking from the side of the road towards the wicket. Some inner feeling forced the inspector to hide. The stranger's strong build, one might even say gorilla-like, with his broad shoulders and the black hat pulled down over his eyes together, created a rather menacing impression. As the man began to approach the fence, the dog's barking became louder. Galbraith noticed how he slightly slowed down his pace and, right as he walked, put his right hand in the pocket of his black, formal jacket. The inspector watched in silent amazement as the man took out of his pocket a pistol, shining in the midday sun, somewhat similar to those used by the fascists in the Second World War, and, cocking the trigger, stopped at the wicket. "I should have retreated to a safe place," Galbraith thought, watching as the stranger stood in a threatening pose and held his weapon out in front of him. The next second, the muscular man sharply jerked his leg forward. Wow, he has strength, Galbraith thought, looking at how the wicket immediately gave in to his kick. Suddenly a shot rang out, and a high, heart-rending dog scream reached the inspector's ears. That's it, Galbraith thought, this thug is shooting at an animal, but be that as it may, he, hiding around the corner of the fence, did not take any action, because he understood that in a foreign country, and even in some deserted place, it was better to try to stay away from trouble. Therefore, when, after 5 shots, a cry from a young man was suddenly heard from behind the fence, apparently the owner of the house, Galbraith only dryly stated the fact that the poor dog would never again have to run around the glade for butterflies. After the man with the weapon stepped over the threshold of the wicket, Galbraith finally decided to see what was going on there. He slowly, trying not to make any noise, walked forward and stopped at such a distance that he could see what was happening inside the site. A massacre was taking place there. A gorilla-like man in a hat, who no longer had a pistol in his hands, was inflicting strong kicks on some young guy in a white shirt who was lying under his feet. The inspector, peering into what was happening, noted that he could not find the dog's corpse. He made the assumption that the killer probably threw the animal away from the gate, or that the dog, not being completely killed, crawled to the side. Trying to comprehend what was happening, Galbraith could not help but notice that the killer's movements were somewhat hesitant, as if he was afraid that the kicks would cause severe damage. Usually, the policeman thought, killers act on the dictates of instinct and completely indulge in the feeling of aggression, but the body language of this man was as if he was not really beating the guy, but was only pretending to fake the beating. Suddenly Galbraith heard a car stop behind him. He turned around. It turns out that the taxi driver really did not deceive him and returned for his passenger. "Get in, we're moving on," the taxi driver shouted from the window. The inspector feverishly opened the door and climbed into the car, simultaneously hitting the top of his head against its ceiling. He wanted to quickly leave this place, but he had to wait. The driver, quietly cursing, fiddled with the ignition key, which did not want to turn. Galbraith, whose heart was beating wildly, glanced out the window. A muscular man in a black jacket, distracted by the sound of an approaching car, left the beating of the young guy and turned towards the road. At the same time, his hat involuntarily flew off his head, and the inspector was finally able to see his face. "My goodness, it is," Galbraith whispered with just his lips. But he didn't have time to finish. The taxi driver finally managed to turn the ignition key, and the car moved sharply forward. Due to the suddenness of this maneuver, the inspector did not have time to react in time, and his face was buried in the back of the front seat. Galbraith leaned back in his seat with a curse, feeling that a lump was slowly beginning to swell on his forehead. "Did you hit a little?" the taxi driver asked without a hint of sympathy. "Never mind," his passenger answered, feeling the hematoma. Overcoming the pain, Galbraith lowered his hand and, trying to position himself as comfortably as possible, began to think about the event that he happened to observe a couple of minutes ago. The killer, as he managed to notice, had facial features very similar to pharmaceutist Mr. Yonce, the same prominent cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a powerful jaw. Another doppelganger, or more accurately, Dreifachgänger, thought the inspector. But Galbraith was confused by the fact that this particular person's face had a grayish tint, which stood out strongly against the background of the stranger's pink ears and neck. As if some kind of sunscreen was applied to the man's face, or... Galbraith admitted a crazy theory that this man wore a mask on his face in order to resemble father of the late Delia. "Staging," whispered the inspector. Yes, this is exactly the word he used to describe this incident. What he saw, with a high degree of probability, could have been an imitation, a skillfully played performance. Galbraith immediately remembered the words of his late friend. He said that when he, along with a police squad, was going to arrest Mr. Thurlow, they got to the criminal's house just at the moment when Mr. Yonce used a pistol to kill the Jordan's dog and began to trample him, owner of the house. The inspector compared Farkraut's story with what he saw now. Yes, he was not an eyewitness to that incident, but all the details coincided. Except that he never saw the dog, it seemed that instead of a real animal behind the fence there was a record player hidden from prying eyes that played a tape with pre-recorded sounds of barking. Quite a logical explanation, he thought. Then it was clear why this Ivolginsky had such strange body plasticity. He did not really beat the guy, but only played the beating scene, like an actor on a theater stage. The only thing that was unclear was who staged this performance and why. And most importantly, for what purpose, for whom was this whole presentation intended? At that moment the car stopped moving. "So, we're already here," muttered the driver. The inspector woke up from his thoughts and opened the door, preparing to get out of the car. "Wait a minute," the driver said and stuck a piece of paper into his hand. "Why did you give this to me?" Galbraith asked as he began to unwrap it. "I just want to tell you that if you have any questions, just call this number." Having said this, the driver turned away and took the wheel. In the end, the inspector climbed out and, without even looking at the departing car, began to look at the piece of paper. There were only 2 lines in it, a telephone number 020-1805-1982 and a name H. Berniezy. Galbraith thought, why did the taxi driver decide that he, a random passenger whom he saw for the first time in his life, might need him? He thought about Dr. Baselard again. Why shouldn't this doctor really give money to a random person with his own car, so that at the right moment he would drive up to the hotel where the inspector was staying, take him to his place and take him to the right places? "That's ridiculous," the inspector said with a grin. Stuffing the piece of paper into his pocket, Galbraith raised his head. He stood near a 4-story building that had all sorts of cafes and storefronts. The taxi driver dropped the inspector off at the modest entrance, above which hung a sign Clarentone. Looking at these blue neon letters, Galbraith involuntarily noticed to himself that because of this Baselard, he had developed such paranoia that if we develop the idea that doctor is behind everything in this world, then in the heat of the moment you can get to the point where if you start digging the Bible, it turns out that Eve gave the apple to Adam not on the inspiration of some abstract serpent tempter, but only because this was the request of Dr. Baselard, who pursued the idea of killing the little girl Delia, who would be born many generations later in the family of the pharmaceutist Yonce.